I'm delighted to have Susan Benesch and Bobby Chesney for what I can promise you is going to be a really interesting conversation, and we'll be excited to have the opportunity to get questions from the audience as well. You have little note cards, as you'll see at your places, and so I'd welcome you to send questions up as they occur to you. I'm Chimène Keitner, as I mentioned. I'm a professor of international law at UC Hastings College of the Law in San Francisco, and we're really delighted to partner with the World Affairs Council to bring you this event, which is the first in a 4-part series on democracy, technology, and security. So be sure to keep an eye out for the next 3 events in the series. But I can't think of better colleagues to kick off the series than Susan and Bobby. And Susan, I wanted to start with you and to invite you to tell us a little bit about your work. You founded the Dangerous Speech Project. What is dangerous speech, and why should we be worried about it?
Dangerous speech is any form of communication that can inspire people to commit or to condone violence against another group of people. It is a definition that I proposed after noticing some uncanny similarities or patterns in the sorts of rhetoric that have been used by influential people, principally civilian political leaders, in the months or years before an outbreak of terrible violence between groups of people, ethnic groups, religious groups, etc. There are certain patterns in this kind of speech across languages, across cultures, across even historical periods. And it occurred to me that if that sort of communication or I say speech, Chimène, and I mean also text or images, any kind of communication, if, as it seems, that's a consistent precursor to violence between groups, perhaps it is also something of a causal factor, and if one could interfere with that, perhaps one could diminish the incidence of violence. And that's something that one can get almost everyone to agree on, which is one reason why I think this is a useful concept. Hate speech, which is by far the more familiar term for, let's say, bad speech, online or offline, is as I've said, the well-known term. But it's complicated since there is no consensus definition for hate speech. In practice, it's almost impossible to get people to agree on which content is hate speech. It's usually whatever I don't like or whatever offends me, and therefore leads to as much argument as it does to consensus. Dangerous speech seems to be a category on which people can agree, partly because of the category itself and partly because they agree on preventing what seems to be its consequence.
So you mentioned dangerous speech online and offline, particularly since we're focusing tonight on technology. I'm wondering, can you tell us a little bit about how dangerous speech manifests itself online and how that makes it a particular problem in this day and age?
Unfortunately, it's all too common. I should say also that dangerous speech, it's not a toggle. That it isn't that speech is dangerous or it's not. It can be more or less dangerous, as you can imagine. You can think about a spectrum in which at one end there is content that's extremely dangerous that would fit the American First Amendment standard under the famous case of Brandenburg v. Ohio. That is speech that brings about a probability of imminent lawless action, as we say. And then along that spectrum, there would be content that is still capable of shifting norms of discourse and behavior, but perhaps not all the way toward imminent violence. So that kind of content circulates almost everywhere online to one extent or another. A particularly well-known example at the moment is in Myanmar or Burma, where there's a great deal of content online designed to convince the majority Buddhist population of that country that Muslims, especially members of the Rohingya minority, in Myanmar are terrible people and constitute an existential threat to the majority population and even to the identity of the country as a Buddhist nation. That's just one of many examples.
And we'll talk certainly in this hour about various potential responses, both in the private sector and governmental responses to this problem that, as you say, has manifested itself in a number of countries and with very disastrous results. But I want to get Bobby in at this stage so that people can learn a little bit about the work that you've been doing recently. Susan has a background as a journalist and has been very focused for years on freedom of expression issues and trying to navigate those issues. You have a national security law background, and I'd love you to tell us a little bit about your recent work with your co-author, Daniel Citroen, on the problem of deep fakes.
Very happy to do that, and thank you for having us here, and thanks to all of y'all who are here in person. I really appreciate you giving us your time tonight to talk about these important issues. So, as Chimène mentioned, I have recently co-authored an article with the amazing Danielle Citroen, law professor at University of Maryland. Danielle is a leading figure at the intersection of privacy and technology, and including especially the impact of technology on harmful impacts on women. My background is more on the national security side, the legal regulation of intelligence activities and other activities. But we share an interest in the disruptive effects of technology on these legal architectures that concern harms both individual, which is more in Danielle's sphere, and societal or at the national security level, which is more mine. And it wasn't that long ago that we were comparing notes, and Danielle started talking about a technological innovation that's been popularly referred to as deep fakes. And I'm just curious whether, just a quick show of hands in the room, whether that's a phrase you've at least heard about. I'll give a very quick overview.
And so for the radio audience, I would say it's still under 10% probably of the folks in the room.
I was tempted to ask the listeners to raise their hands, but then I thought, no, we'll pass on that. So to make a long story short, the idea here is fraudulent video or audio that is well beyond the norms. Of course, fraudulent video and audio of real people doing or saying things they've never said or done, that's not new. Lies, fraudulent depictions of or claims about what people said or did, that's as old as can be. What we're interested in is the subset of technology that's emerging out of research into neural networks, deep learning techniques, and in particular, a subset of that in which algorithms, two neural network algorithms, are pitted against one another in an evolutionary learning cycle where one is trying to create better and better falsified imagery, not just imagery, but video and audio, and the other one's detecting and then repeat cycle with improvements on and on and on. The upshot of it all is that Danielle and I concluded that under the current state of technology, we're getting close to the time in which there are methods of doing this that produce results that will defeat any of us in our eye test or our ear test and trying to detect it through ordinary human senses, and will be pretty good against a lot of technical means as well. Now, there already are such technologies. Hollywood could make, Hollywood in Rogue One, I think, made Grand Moff Tarkin reappear after Peter Cushing had died years ago. The technology we're concerned about here has the ability to proliferate and become more commonly accessible, and we're already starting to see some commercialization of it. So as she started thinking about this from the perspective of individual harms in the privacy space, and I started thinking about its uses at the national security level, and I'm using that term very broadly here to encompass attacks on our democracy, attacks on truth itself, but also more conventional national security harms, like the way this could be used by a foreign intelligence service to make it seem like, well, we were having a conversation earlier, and the example I want to use is that a foreign intelligence service might create a falsified but deeply credible and hard to detect false recording of a U.S. official saying something terribly disparaging about a foreign country and then use that to try to harm us in our international relations. Some of the students we were speaking with, their reaction was, well, you don't necessarily have to fake that. True, touche. But you can imagine that the general principle still applies. And so we have written a paper that you can find online easily. It's freely available. It's going to be published in the California Law Review. But the draft is out there. If you just search my last name, Chesney, and deep fakes, you'll find it. And it is more than you ever wanted to know about exactly what is this technology and what are the parade of horribles that might follow from it, and what might we think about how we could address that. So that's what we've been focused on. And I would point out that Susan's bailiwick here is the dangerous speech. And in our bailiwick, the deepfakes intersects with that some, maybe on the edge, but it's a separate circle, so kind of a Venn diagram, if you will.
Did you want to add anything to that about how your fields of interest intersect, Susan, or should we?
No, I think that's a great description. In fact, very often dangerous speech is also false, but not always, so it is precisely a Venn diagram, yep.
In terms of internet searches of deepfakes that you might do, if you search that term today, you'll also probably turn up a letter from 3 congressional representatives who are now officially asking the Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coats, to prepare a report on deepfakes and their implications for national security and steps that Congress might take. And that opens up the question of who is responsible, essentially, for ensuring the or preserving an information environment in which consumers of information, of which we all are, but also users of these different platforms and services, can tell when something is authentic or inauthentic, manufactured or genuine. Is that the responsibility of each of us to become sufficiently well educated and versed in different techniques so that we can spot the fakes when we see them? Is it for the platforms to figure out some way of detecting and monitoring these kinds of this kind of speech or these kinds of videos and images, or is it for governments to take a stand and develop regulations in this area? And I know you both have a variety of things to say on that, so I'll give the floor to you.
Why don't I first say something depressing about the individual education aspect, and then Susan, come back to you about the platforms, and then we can pass the mic back and forth about government. On the individuals. So when we first started, when Danielle and I first started circulating our paper for comments from others and asking people to think with us about what are some tools that can be brought to bear, what legal tools, regulatory tools, technological tools, business models, very often the first reaction people had was, well, education, right? Spread the word, ring the bell that your paper's doing that, and people should learn to be savvier consumers of information. This is a common refrain about our more general problems of disinformation. And the suggestion was, you've just got to make sure people understand that it is possible and will become increasingly available to create these deeply credible but false video and audio records. And early on, we realized something that I think maybe is the most important contribution we're making in the paper, which is to point out that if we succeed in doing that, there is a terrible price to be paid, and we call it the liar's dividend. The idea is that if you really do sensitize people to not trust what their eyes are seeing and their ears are hearing in video and audio evidence, this will be useful in limiting the harm from fakes, but it will be used by people of bad will who are trying to escape accountability for things that have been captured that were quite legitimate, authentic, and real. And as we put it in the paper, the cry of fake news becomes the cry of deep fake news and is all the more harmful as a result. So we're not as enthused about the education solution as we once were. Now, the platforms have a role, but it's a complicated one.
It is. That's in part because, paradoxically, I'm kind of envious of Bobby and Danielle for their topic of deep fakes, in the sense that the way that they describe those, they are content that is entirely fake, that is unquestionably fake. The problem is that it's very difficult to detect the fact that it's fake, but there doesn't seem to be any doubt or any ambiguity. Regarding many other types of content, it is not either false or true. It is partially false or partially faked. That is another problem, and an enormously challenging one, and one of the reasons why I would be worried about putting too much power or responsibility in the hands of platforms in this regard. I would imagine that many of you have heard that one of the defining characteristics of propaganda is that it often begins with some grain of truth, which it then exaggerates or distorts to produce propaganda. So that's something that is partially false or again, distorted. If you ask platforms to take down content, for example, to delete content that is false, you put them in the position of having to draw a line between what's true and what's false. That would be in practice extremely difficult and very hard to do without some judgment calls, some line drawing, which would necessarily require consciously or unconsciously the use of someone's values or opinions. And I would be, frankly, I wouldn't want government to do that for the reasons implicit in what I've just said, and for the same reason would be very worried about having platforms do it, particularly if the result is that they take content down. A middle ground might be for platforms to put some sort of marker on content that has that is suspect, or of course to, as some platforms have already begun to do, to rely on credible third parties to do fact checking, and then to refer to the conclusions of those third parties. I say third parties in the plural because I think the chances of reliable judgments are greater if you have a variety of sources.
Well, and let's talk about that question of judgments at the moment, because the two of you can quantify this with numbers, but my understanding is that with some of these platforms, and we talk about platforms, we mean the Googles and the Facebooks and the Twitters and the WhatsApps of the world, particularly in countries where they've really proliferated, and in which mobile phone technology has also proliferated, such that you've got literally hundreds of millions, if not billions, of users. How could we, even if we were to divine the perfect filtration mechanism and design the perfect rules for figuring out what degree of falsity we will tolerate on a certain platform, how on earth can anyone be expected to make those judgment calls in real time in a way that would prevent some of the harmful effects that you're worried about?
I don't have an answer. I wish I did. There's even, I'm sorry to say, another difficulty, which is that even if in theory some perfectly objective, infallible third-party source existed to declare that content is false or isn't, people wouldn't necessarily believe it. After all, people are more likely to trust sources they know. Within each social group, there are some sources that are influential, and those vary from group to group. So sometimes, unfortunately, it is whether someone believes a piece of content depends as much on where it seems to originate as on what the content actually says.
Well, and wasn't that sort of one of the big problems in sort of use of social media and dissemination of messages before the 2016 elections, and a problem that we're confronting now in the run-up to the 2020 elections? We'll be discussing election interference here in greater detail on October 25th, but Bobby, Susan mentioned, people tend to rely on some assessment of the credibility of where the messages are coming from. Separate from the question of deep fakes, isn't another huge problem knowing where messages are coming from and false representations as to either the nationality or the identity of where various messages or videos or images are coming from, and how can we address that?
Well, even if we extract all elements of fraud and just talk about the problems of our information environment. The information tribalism, as my co-author Danielle refers to it, information tribalism is besetting us and at the root of many of our problems, and the tensions we have, the separate truths that people are embracing are reflected in this. And this, I think, is a product, an almost inevitable product of a combination of two things. One, we all have cognitive biases. This is well familiar. If that phrase doesn't resonate for you, do yourself a favor and get a copy of Thinking Fast and Slow and become acquainted with the wonderful insights into all of our frailties of how we process information and the way we inevitably make certain mistakes for reasons that we can't quite control. But it has to do, in this context, with the things that Chimène was mentioning, the tendency to prefer and trust information that's validated because it's information shared by others we know, and there's a tendency to silo, to not want to be confronted with challenging information. We all know that. I'm as guilty as anybody is of not really wanting to follow on Twitter somebody who says things I just disagree with. There's a psychic cost to it. And it's so soothing to instead follow people who say things that look like what I already think is right, because, boy, that makes me feel smarter. It just works better that way. If only everyone felt that same way about what I thought was right, we'd all be in business. But we have different perceptions, and we don't have to all agree. Now, you combine that with the current information marketplace that we've got. We're long past the days when there were a handful of mainstream media outlets that were major broadcast platforms that exercised a degree of curating that kept out, for the most part, deeply problematic falsehoods or fraudulent or misleading types of information, though maybe not always, but for the most part. But on the other hand, there was a cost to that system. It homogenized the information and perspectives and the voices we were allowed to hear. For a long time, as that system gave way to the many-to-many model of information that we now have thanks to technological change, it seemed great because it gave everybody a voice. You can have all kinds of micro-audiences. Everyone could be heard. How wonderful. Let all the flowers bloom. But it turns out you combine that with the cognitive biases, and falsehoods, misleading things, conspiracy theories can zip around and magnify and reinforce one another. It's almost like the way a firestorm can emerge. You have a certain volume of things burning, and if you get the conditions right, it can accelerate and become bigger unto itself. We have sort of a disinformation firestorm kind of constantly burning online now.
We're all going to leave this session feeling really positive and optimistic with our outlook, aren't we? But Susan, on the note of optimism, or at least not feeling helpless in the situation, I mean, you've thought a lot about and studied different possible interventions that can be made in the face of the harmful speech that we all encounter online. You know, Bobby and Danielle talk about in their very systematic paper different possible responses to the problem of deep fakes. How about this notion that, as we sometimes hear, you know, the answer to bad speech is more speech? And I think you've talked about something that you call counter speech. Tell us, is there cause for some glimmer of hope in possible responses to the predicament we're in?
Absolutely. At the risk of sounding Pollyannish, I want to offer some ideas contrarian to all of this gloom. First of all, for people to hate one another is not new. In particular, for people to fear and look down on another group of people is not new at all. In fact, I would suggest to you that it is something that has been an unquestioned, completely normal feature of the lives and consciousness of the vast majority of people who've ever lived. Think about history for a moment. Read the Old Testament. What is new and different in the world today in this context is that I'm happily willing to bet you that there are at least tens of thousands of people in the world, if not more, who now believe that to despise another group of humans is bad. And they try to resist it themselves and try to convince other people not to do it. So that's a significant change, first of all. The online world has brought about another change that is distressing in the short to medium term, but I think potentially maybe even salutary in the longer term, and that is that we are all exposed to what I call the internal speech of other human communities. Let me explain what I mean by that. I think it's a very familiar and almost universal human practice to speak in a particular way when you think you're talking to your own, whatever that means. Your own family, your own classmates, your own team members, the people in the same congregation, your own ethnic group, and so forth. There are jokes you tell when you think it's just you and nobody else, not the people from outside your group, right? Anybody? People are nodding in the audience. Now, what happens online? The guy who would have said something about women on a hunting group or in a on a hunting trip or in a smoke-filled room or in a locker room 30 years ago, pre-internet, knew to whom he was saying those things, to whom he was making that remark. Generally, I'm going to make some unfair assumption or some stereotypes, please forgive me, but the guy who said something like that would know that he was saying it only to men. And chances are, and he would know how many, since he was looking at them. And probably he knew them personally so he could make a guess about how they would respond. He knew that nobody else would overhear that remark. Now, if he puts that up on Facebook or tweets it, sooner or later, somebody outside of his own, some darn woman, for example, will see that, will overhear it, actually oversee it, if you like, technically, and very often will protest. What this outsider, or very often a variety of outsiders, end up doing is attempting to hold that person accountable to another set of norms. The exposure to that internal speech of another community is distressing to people who don't share the norms, and very often the person, what I call the original speaker, resists this attempt to hold them accountable to other norms. But what I'm most interested in is the result over time that encounter, that often collision, has on what I call the audience. That is to say, other people who are spectators to that exchange. And what we do see in quite a lot of cases is that slowly discourse norms shift in the direction of the norms of the larger group, which is often, from my perspective, favorable. So the collision is unpleasant, and it is distressing often for outsiders to see this internal speech of other normative communities, but slowly the rebuke that the outsiders deliver shifts, I think, the discourse norms of the larger community. We don't have anywhere near enough research on this so that I can say to you that I know that this is overall favorable. We must study that more quantitatively and at scale.
Yeah, no, I definitely want to get Bobby in on this, because the anonymity of the web also is disinhibiting for some people, one would say. But give us your thoughts.
I thought that was, Susan, that was immensely well described. You've kind of captured things I've sort of intuited maybe were the case, but I hadn't really heard it put that way, and that was really powerfully descriptive to me. But I also thought about how there is a cost to the it's a refinement trend over time, and there's clearly a lot of salutary things about that. It does, I suspect, leave some of these I guess, the smaller speech cultures, if we will, probably cultivating a sense of grievance, right? A sense that being besieged, and I think we see a lot of that. That's one piece of a larger, we're besieged grievance element that is a bit toxic in our current political culture. And so maybe that over time, that's, it's sort of like the medicine has a side effect, and this will ultimately be okay over time. But I'm not 100% sure it will be, and I worry about where we are in terms of people feeling aggrieved on all sides at a certain point.
Yes. I have to admit that's you're completely right, and I worry about that. I'd be crazy not to. And as I say, I am in what I said. I was extrapolating from what I have observed in specific examples, in particular anecdotes. So I could give you examples in which I can demonstrate a favorable shift. What I don't know is what is happening on the large scale or what is happening over time.
So I want to turn to some really interesting questions we've received from the audience soon. But before I do, I just want to push a little bit on this idea of norms of discourse and norms of interacting online in two ways, and then I'll hand this over. So the first, Susan, you mentioned in terms of norms of discourse and sort of the ways in which people interact and kind of community expectations that are set. And so you've talked at various points in your work about the fact that platforms also have terms of service that to a certain extent inform individuals as to what is and isn't appropriate conduct on their platforms, but also that they have much less transparent and accessible standards that they themselves are applying in making decisions about what stays online, what gets taken down, what gets flagged, and so on and so forth. Can you give those who are listening and who are here today a little bit more of a granular sense? Just walk us through what happens when something offensive is posted on a platform of your choice. What recourse do people who are offended by that have, and how do we know what will happen next?
Yes, Chimène, you said that platforms have terms of service. Those are essentially, terms of service encompass all different sorts of rules. Generally within the terms of service, there's a sort of subset of rules that different platforms call by different names, sometimes community standards, for example, which is a weird misnomer since, of course, all of the people who are on Facebook, who are on Twitter, or who are on Twitter don't constitute a community. They're not even a group. They're lots and lots of people. And I think you said the platforms inform their users with these terms of service, but I'm going to mischievously argue that they don't, since those terms of service are generally written by American lawyers. And though all of us three are American lawyers, with all respect to us and others, we write rules in ways that are often not so, let's say, scintillating for anybody, lawyers or others, to read. So they're written in this long-winded, confusing language, these rules about what content is allowed and what isn't allowed to stay on a platform. And then the platforms bury these rules in the terms of service in thousands of words that appear in tiny print. And you get to see all those words if you don't click yes in that little, if you don't click that little box. Now, I have developed the practice of asking my students what platforms they use, and they recite, I don't know, Facebook. No, they don't. Maybe they don't use Facebook anymore. Snapchat, Instagram, etc. Then I ask, have you ever read the rules of any platform that you use? And everybody here in the audience is laughing or shaking their heads no. Same with my students. I have yet to find one student who has read even one rule of any platform that they use. So what does this mean? It means that we are all being governed by rules that we've never read. And it should not surprise you that people are less likely to obey rules that they've never seen. So just to very quickly finish answering your question, Chimène, I would therefore suggest that platforms are using rules, But these public-facing versions of the rules that are there in the terms of service are effectively invisible, since nobody has read them, almost nobody. I've read most of them, but anyway. They also have a different set of rules, which are much more detailed, much more granular, and those are the rules that are actually used by the long-suffering people who make decisions by thousands every day of decisions whether to take down or leave up a particular piece of content. Those rules have to be exceedingly detailed for two reasons, and with that I'll conclude. One is that human beings are very creative, so they put up all different kinds of content, an enormous variety of content. So, for example, if there's a rule against nudity, you can imagine that it isn't very easy to decide which is nudity that's prohibited and which is nudity that's art, just to give you one example. So the rules have to be tremendously detailed in order to describe all the different sorts of content. And then they have to be tremendously detailed so that the thousands and thousands of people around the world who work usually as subcontractors for platforms making all these decisions will make decisions that are consistent with each other's decisions and also with their own previous decisions. You wouldn't believe how hard it is even to get one person to make decisions that are the same as the ones they made before and after lunch or yesterday or last week.
And Bobby, I have a question for you, and then just as a warning, I'm going to ask you each if you have a question for the other person. So be thinking of that. But one other point that you make in your paper, Bobby, that I think is worth highlighting in this conversation are the unintended consequences, perhaps, not of deepfakes themselves, but of our responses to deepfakes. And in particular, you and Danielle sound the alarm with respect to our expectations of privacy. Not that we need more reasons to be worried coming out of here tonight, but why don't you give us one more?
Okay, great. I'm glad you asked about that. I will confess I do love dystopian fiction, and so maybe that inflected too much what we wrote, but we have another bummer of a point that I'd like to share with you. We imagine in a world in which deepfakes begin to show their efficacy in tipping an election here, sinking somebody's prospects there, eventually, barring a technological breakthrough that would make it relatively easy to incorporate detection algorithms into both the devices that capture content in the first instance to market in some immutable way, and the platforms that accept upload so they can filter with it. Barring all that, we imagine then a world in which this is a known and recognized threat that really matters for at least the subset of people, maybe politicians, maybe public figures of other kinds, people who have fragile and significant reputational interests that could be grievously harmed through such fakery. What might the market do in response to that? Because there'll be some people who have some money to spend to try to insulate themselves. And if you were running a startup, and here we are in the Bay Area, so we got to think about startups. If you were running a startup, or you were trying to launch a new enterprise line, what might you offer? And we began to think about the possibility that you could, if you had enough motivation, be willing to have a type of life logging that's much more comprehensive and affecting others than is currently the case. Think body cams, think ubiquitous wear of audio and video capture that is coupled with maybe got to say blockchain, right? Blockchain-enabled authentication mechanism to securely be able, through a third-party vendor that you're paying for the service, to document where you were, at what times, what you actually said, what you did, and create an immutable alibi service. Now, when you say it against the backdrop of the way things are currently, that sounds a little kooky. Not too many people are going to do this. But imagine a world just a little over the horizon where you begin to have these types of problems, and then think about employers who may, even though no individual wants to lifelog this way to that extent, the employer may need you to do it, and they may require it. And there's a slight analogy here to police departments and body cams, right? There's a sort of a slight proof of concept there. And so we imagine a world in which that begins to become more commonplace and perhaps integrating with technological change regarding wearables. So many people in this room probably have Apple Watches on or the like. We all are familiar with the recent sort of ill-fated first run with Google Glasses. Wearables with lots of sensing capacity are coming beyond what we've got now, beyond our Fitbits. So we think the technology will get there, and there may be a market for it, and if and when there is, that's going to be a ubiquitous erosion of privacy, not just in public places where maybe you'd be on camera anyways, but also in more private places like this. So that's pretty fun. Here you go, Chimène.
In the paper, Bobby, you and Danielle also thoughtfully and importantly contemplate remedies for the problem of deep fakes. I'd like to ask you to help us think about not only the creation and the posting of deep fakes, but also their dissemination, and about the fact that it's easy to think of the person who makes a deep fake as a bad actor or even a criminal. But surely there may be many people, particularly since, as you have explained, it will be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to identify a deep fake. So surely the vast majority of the people who disseminate deep fakes will be doing it unknowingly. And they may even think that they're doing a very good thing because they're warning their friends against something terrible. So what do you do about that, about the fact that, that people who are disseminating harmful content may be doing it innocently or even with a sense of moral righteousness? Right.
So this is a real problem when we build into this hypothetical, my premise, which is that we may get to the point where, in the first instance, this thing isn't detectable. That's the whole point of saying we have a technological innovation here. If you accept that, then you're probably not going to have much luck, and it wouldn't be right to impose costs on people who are not in a plausible position to know that they're passing along something that's not just harmful, but it's fraudulent. On the other hand, that's point in time one, but there's a whole spectrum of time. So we're talking about scenarios where real people are being harmfully depicted in certain ways, which means that at least for a subset, not all, but for a subset of deepfakes, those that circulate publicly, remember, there will be private circulation, bespoke harms, an employer who receives one of these, a romantic prospect receives one of these, and the person who's being sabotaged never knows. But for the stuff that gets distributed publicly, eventually, perhaps you do know. And then you get into this question of going to platforms and going to other outlets, but the major platforms, and trying to test their processes for taking in these kinds of complaints, validating them, and then maybe taking the content down. It could just pop up again later. But if you successfully complain and identify something as fake, it should be technologically relatively easy to take that content, hash it, circulate the hash the same way they do with like child pornography and that sort of thing, and then the next time it shows up anywhere by anybody who's received that profile, it can be filtered out before it gets out again. It's not a perfect solution, but I think it does at least start to respond on the back end. And it could be that there's a role for regulators or government in making sure that platforms at least do that much. No, they'll probably want to do it on their own.
And Bobby, I'm going to invite you to ask a question of Susan.
So we had on the way over here, we had this fascinating conversation that I'd love to hear more about the role of not just the persons who engage in dangerous speech, however we define it, the category of beyond, incitement plus, whatever it is, but those who are not the creators, but who are the catalysts or magnifiers who bring it on home. Because it never had occurred to me to think about the chain of people who are involved in this. Can you talk about that with our audience, and perhaps share some views on whether the remedies for this problem of dangerous speech are different vis-a-vis the magnifiers as opposed to the creators?
Yeah, first of all, just to bring our radio and in-person audiences a bit more into that conversation, I gave as illustrations what I sometimes call transnational speech crises. So these are cases like the video clip, The Innocence of Muslims, that was produced in the United States, but that catalyzed violence in other countries. Or the famous Danish cartoons that were, of course, produced in Denmark and published in a provincial Danish newspaper, and then also were disseminated abroad and led to violence in other countries. So, or the unfortunately more than one case in which a minister in Gainesville, Florida, called Terry Jones, threatened to burn the Quran, and then this led to killings in Afghanistan. In each of these cases, there is an originator of the content, a threat, a video, a cartoon, but the violence doesn't happen until someone else, who I call a malevolent bridge figure, someone else carries this content from one community or from one country or from one normative environment to another one. For example, in the case of The Innocence of Muslims, there was a television broadcaster in Egypt who spoke about that video clip on Egyptian television. And then people who responded with violence had listened to him and watched him, but most of them had never even seen the clip, the video, the Innocence of Muslims. So first of all, it would be possible for such a person, for this malevolent bridge figure, to describe content that didn't even exist. It would be possible for such a person to say, there's someone in the United States who burned the Quran. And that would arguably be, this comes back to the question of fake and real content. It could be just as inciting, just as dangerous to say that whether there was indeed someone who threatened to burn the Quran or did burn the Quran. This is not to say that the original producer of highly inciting content doesn't bear some responsibility if the harm is foreseeable. But that this bridge figure or this secondary figure can cause just as much harm by inventing content, and that we must think carefully about the originator of a message and then about the audience and why it is that particular messages are powerful with certain audiences. This is part of an analytical framework for dangerous speech, which I won't describe, but will just say that the dangerousness of any content depends very importantly on the speaker, on the source, on, of course, the nature of the content itself, and third, on the audience and how susceptible that audience is. These three elements were identified by Aristotle. I can't take any credit.
Well, one of the benefits of the internet, of course, is that if you want to learn more about that work, you can look at the website for the Dangerous Speech Project. And as Bobby has also mentioned, his paper is available online, as are episodes of the National Security Law podcast that he co-hosts, and his analysis of a variety of issues on the Lawfare blog that he co-founded, on which I occasionally opine as well. So lots of things to pursue. In addition to some of the issues that we've already covered that came up in the audience questions, we have a specific question here about the First Amendment, and a question about whether the First Amendment has been overtaken by technology in the first instance? And in the second instance, how do we think about whether the First Amendment applies to entities such as Facebook? In other words, are people who are having their content removed under these terms of service or these somewhat opaque or very opaque standards, can they feel in some respect that their First Amendment rights have been infringed, or are we talking about something different?
I'll say something about the latter part first. This question of, so some basics about the First Amendment. It's a rule protecting our free marketplace of ideas and expression. It's a rule about keeping the government from interfering unduly with that free marketplace. And if we were talking about scenarios of dangerous speech or deep fakes taking place on the National Mall, then it would make a lot of sense to wonder about the roles and the propriety of having the National Park Service cops shutting down the speech and deciding what's across the line. But we're talking about platforms a lot in this conversation, platforms that are private enterprises, and the internet as overall a private enterprise. And I think one of the interesting questions of our time that's gradually being ground out and has a long way to go is, to what extent might First Amendment principles be extended to those entities, notwithstanding the overall private nature of their operations? And I'll describe a little heard of but very interesting recent case from a district judge, a federal judge in Washington, dealing with the scenario in which there's a constantly litigated phenomenon in our society where you have businesses with websites that have lots of interesting data on them. So airlines, for example, all the flights and arrivals and prices. You can imagine all the different things like that, where there might be other businesses that would love to actually, if there was an efficient way to get that data, maybe repackage it and use it to draw people to their websites. So this has been a recurring problem for about 20 years, the battle between these usually small competitors wanting to scrape information off of Facebook or an airline or what have you, and then the airlines, the websites that are trying to protect their data and don't want you going to the other site, will take steps to try to keep those other people off. They might threaten to sue them. They might just try to identify the IP address they're coming from and just bar them. There is a scenario like that where the interest of the would-be information grabber, in this case, is a bunch of professors who want to do research. They want to test real estate websites with test data to smoke out, say, racial bias or other forms of bias. And this is something that commonly happens in the physical world. That's an old form of academic research. It can be very impactful. A lot of these real estate websites are super not interested in this, and they've defined their terms of use in ways that say you can't do that. And eventually, if we figure out who you are, we're just going to block you from the site. The professors brought an action in federal court for a declaratory judgment, an anticipation in advance that if the company sued them for violating the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, would the statute apply to them? And if so, is there a First Amendment problem here? And the court's opinion goes on at great length. The case is called Sandvig, S-A-N-D-V-I-G. The judge is Judge John Bates, really smart judge in federal court in D.C., and he basically says, well, I'm not sure I don't think the statute should apply here, but there's language in it suggesting that there is something special about the internet and public-facing websites, even though they're private, because that is where our conversation has to take place in 2018 and more so in the future. And so I kind of view that as a little shot across the bow of more traditional ways of thinking about the First Amendment's role in this space.
Susan, do you have views you'd like to share at this juncture about the role of the First Amendment in this conversation about taking down various potentially harmful forms of speech and or deep fakes?
Well, first of all, we do have some laws that criminalize certain forms of speech that are false, such as fraud and defamation. In spite of our First Amendment law in the United States, which is a radical outlier, our law, our First Amendment law, as interpreted currently by the Supreme Court and other courts, is much more protective of speech than any other law in the world. For example, hate speech is not only not criminalized in the United States, though it is in many other countries. It is your protected, constitutionally protected right to express hate speech in American public discourse. So that leaves the platforms in a rather difficult position in the sense that most of them claim to have one set of rules for the whole world. Then one last quick observation about the First Amendment versus platforms and platform rules is that the platform rules are generally much more restrictive of speech than the First Amendment is, since, again, the First Amendment is highly speech protective. First Amendment is designed to allow you to say almost anything, or a lot more than the bodies of speech law of every other country on earth. So just to give one example, the major platforms do now prohibit some version of hate speech or of inflammatory speech that is broader than the First Amendment.
Well, and you raise a really interesting question that we'll have to pursue in a future conversation about the fact that these companies do operate globally, and yet there are countries that, of course, impose rules about various things. Many of us have heard, at least in passing, about the various right to be forgotten cases in Europe and the debates about the extent to which a particular country's laws that may apply to the operation of a particular social media platform in that country almost by default end up forcing the company to move towards a more sort of speech restrictive common denominator in how it operates. Believe it or not, we only have a few minutes remaining. So I want to sort of think a little bit more about the role of governments, and in particular, Bobby, thinking about your past experience in the national security space. Mm-hmm. You mentioned in your paper a number of the beneficial uses of deep fakes, and then some of the potentially very dangerous uses of deep fakes, including in the context of armed conflict. And the evolution of norms in cyberspace is something that Bobby and I have both given a fair bit of thought to. One thing I wonder if you and Danielle have thought about is, to the extent that you would want to see norms emerge prohibiting the use of deep fakes, both by the private sector and presumably by governments that can really militarize or weaponize that technology. Is that a restriction, without going into anything classified, of course, that you may or may not have been privy to? Is that a restriction you think the U.S. government should or would be amenable to placing on itself in terms of how we operate?
Well, so there's many interesting things you've raised there. One is, what do we even actually mean? I've kind of glossed over the definition of deepfakes by simply referencing the technology and then mentioning at a few points that the thing we're concerned about is the use of that technology to cause harm. So there's an intent element there and there's an effect element there. I'm glad you mentioned that we do talk about the beneficial uses as well. And I want to give an example that to me is very striking. I was surprised by my own reaction to learning about it. Danielle and I had learned of a particular company, Liarbird is the name of the company, that was working with this technology. And I will tell you that the initial reaction we had was that we didn't like this company because we thought they were kind of hubristic in the way they talked about the technology on their website and how their use of this technology to create highly realistic fake audio, trust them, they're so great, et cetera. So I'm making them sound kind of bad because I'm about to take it all back. I learned relatively recently that they've got a pro bono project where they're using their technology to restore the voice to victims of Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS, people who've become paralyzed, can't speak. And I had a dear friend I grew up with who died of that not that long ago, and remember a long period in which she couldn't speak. She had to communicate with a computer that would read her eye movements, and I thought, what an amazing blessing for all the people, for whatever reason, who've lost their voice, if there's something that the algorithm could train on and bring their voice back to them. So the fact that something is a fraudulent depiction, well, fraudulent's pejorative there, isn't it, is a non-natural, inauthentic depiction of someone's real voice. It's neither good nor bad inherently. There's some really good artistic uses for it. There's good educational uses for it. The artistic and political satire intersection is pretty obvious. And there's a spectrum of these things. So in order to put our arms around what we really want to suppress, we have to then ultimately get into some definitional details that start getting tricky. So any suggestions about just criminalizing deepfakes as a category or creating civil liability for the propagation or creation of them, I think is going to run into that like a buzzsaw. And so I don't think we should head that direction. You mentioned the national security space. I will just quickly note that we have a parade of horribles about what foreign intelligence services might use these for to cause problems for us in our foreign policy, to drive wedges into our society, to engage in covert action of an information operation kind. It's certainly possible. I have zero insider knowledge about any of this. Anything I ever knew about anything classified is long years ago before I ever heard of any of this technology. It's certainly the case that the technology is as usable by us as it would be by other people. So I don't doubt for a second, and we say in the paper that presumably our intelligence services might find use for this. And you can imagine a million different ways with the conflict with the Islamic State that it might be very handy. You could achieve operational effects through the clever use of fakery to get people to respond to an order and move into a place where they could be attacked or arrested, an order that was never really given by their superior, if you could fake their voice effectively. There are many things that we would want to use this for.
All right, so if we were on KQED Forum with Michael Krasny, the music would be playing now. So I am going to need to say I'm Chimène Keitner from UC Hastings. We've brought this program to you with World Affairs, the first in our 4-part series on democracy, technology, and security. I've been genuinely delighted to have as our first guests Bobby Chesney from UT Austin and Susan Benesch from the Dangerous Speech Project. Thank you so much, and good night.